Well, joining us for more on this very subject, we're joined by public governance expert Zwelinzima Ndevu and Build One South Africa leader Mmusi Maimane. Good evening to both of you. Thanks for your time. Mr. Ndevu, let me kick it off with you. The reaction, as we have just seen, has been mixed, but largely one gets a deep sentiment of outrage and disappointment from South Africans, including the number one citizen, which is the president. Of course, the big question now is, what should happen? We're looking at a week potentially where Janusz Walus will be a free man if the Constitutional Court order is effected in the way that Judge Zondo read it out. The fact that we are questioning if that will be in fact the case also says a lot about the moment.
Good evening, Kathy, and thank you for having me. I think one is not surprised at the outrage and the vibes that we've been hearing. You would remember that there was always been a view that Mr. Walus has not told the real truth, or he has not revealed who were the real people behind. And this is a perception within society because he indeed in court revealed the people that he has worked with. But there has always been that view that those were not the real mastermind of the situation. So we're not surprised about this. But what one must also know is that court decisions are not meant to be popular decisions, are decisions that are meant to apply or interpret the rule of law and ensure that it is applied fairly to everyone that is affected. What one is thinking is that the implementation, although there is an outcry, but court judgments should be implemented irrespective of the outcry unless people take them under review. So one is expecting that the authorities are preparing to release him. If there is recourse, those who are asking for recourse will then follow the due processes of the law to apply for recourse. But as things stand, one is expecting that judgment to be implemented. We would remember that Chris Hani was not an ordinary member of society. So that outcry comes from that. He was a prominent member of the South African Communist Party, chief of staff of ConCourt's, a person that many people look to for hope and to thinking about a country that would be equal, would provide services equally to everyone, and he is still regarded as such. So that outcry comes from that.
Mmusi, it's not insignificant that the opposition to this particular court judgment that we're seeing is coming very strongly out of the tripartite alliance, which also happens to be the governing party and the governing alliance of the day. What are your concerns about that?
Well, good evening, Kathy. Let me first of all say I can appreciate the depth of anger and pain that the Hani family is going through at this moment, because I would think, listening to Medimpo, that in fact there's an injustice being presented here. I think the second point to make is the reason many of us are in politics is because we observed that moment of the gunning down of Chris Hani. Certainly I can speak for myself. Because here was a moment that had the absolute potential to catapult the democratic project in its entirety, in the prominence of Chris Hani. And it was a moment I can certainly remember as a young teenage boy watching. But we dare never forget the equal, the leadership portrayed by President Mandela when he reflected on that moment and led the country to be able to focus on a transition and acknowledge the role played by the white South African who reported the matter. Now, why that's important to reflect on both the chaos or the murder or the heinous crime and the leadership of Mandela is that today the same is necessary. There's a constitutional court that we've all upheld and we've agreed to, and to the Prof's previous words, upholds a particular law. What we now need is political leadership that reaffirms the need for South Africa not only to recognize this moment, but to lead us forward. And I think that's missing. So if the tripartite alliance is going to stand up and keep at war with each other on this particular judgment, society is observing and asking some basic questions. Where is there justice? Where is there a sense upon which we uphold our courts? And furthermore, when we take the matter forward, I wish our laws were written differently. I wish our laws said, look, Janusz Walus must die in jail. But that's not the law. That's what the Constitution upheld the parole law. And therefore, I would argue the case more seriously that political leadership at this time that guides the nation to, in this grieving moment, to also uphold the laws of the Republic.
Zwelinzima, is there a way of calling for judicial review, as we have seen? And what I mean here is the laws that make it possible for somebody like Janusz Walus to become a free man. Is it possible to call for those without being seen at this point to be undermining the judiciary, to be undermining the very state of law that keeps this country together?
I think without one being a legal expert, but one must be wary of creating laws that are applicable to individual or to particular conditions only. Laws must be applied across individual. We must be seen to be all equal before the law. And if we apply, I know the outrage, and I want to agree with Mmusi that this is not a simple or an easy moment to deal with. And we need leadership to be able to deal with decisively. And dealing with it is not by changing the laws. It's by applying the laws, giving rationale to why it is important to apply the law, even if we're not comfortable with the outcomes of the law. If it's interpreted correctly, if the outcomes are correct in terms of the interpretation of the applicable laws, then we should not question who is affected. Tomorrow it might be somebody else. Are we going to say that we need to review the law again to accommodate that particular individual? So or that particular moment, we must just be mindful of that. I think for me, what we need to do, we should look at the greater good and say, what would be the implication of government ignoring this judgment? What would be, in the long run, the greater ramifications for that to happen? And that's what worries me.
Just to add to what you're saying, Zwelinzima, when we look at the argument that was advanced by the Justice Department and the Hani family, they are making an argument that he was exceptional, that his matter cannot be treated like any other matter.
I do agree with them, but I think there are many other cases that are exceptional. So we'd have a number of laws that are applied in different, depending on who or what event has happened. While I do appreciate the fact that this event, this killing of Chris Hani by Janusz Walus, could have taken our country down a different route, I also appreciate the fact that the law must be restorative, must not be punitive in how it's applied.
Mmusi, what do you think we need to be watchful of in the coming weeks and months? We know that there's a program of action that has been called for and that is currently underway and being rolled out, again, by the Tripartite Alliance, and they're bringing in other, supporters and stakeholders who want to be part of it. And all of it really is going to leave the judiciary at the center of that debate, and we know just how much pressure the judiciary has been under anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we all need to guard is that whilst I think our constitution is not perfect, it's certainly been amended a number of times to keep improving, but it ought to be protected. And I think if we then take a broad sweep at constitutionality in this country, we undermine what the 1994 consensus was, which was led so eloquently by those who negotiated that period. Our generation needs to take the preservation of that document going forward. That's the first. So we can't try and remake laws and have the rule of man rather than, in fact, the rule of law. The second issue that's most crucial here is that given where the judiciary sits and the Constitutional Court, I do believe that we must uphold what this judgment holds. And the Minister of Justice must act in accordance. We are going to have a review on our parole laws, which is a separate law, because I do think it has suffered under various interpretation. And so therefore, I think the duty must go back to Parliament to tighten laws around parole so that we never ever have to have a debate about what kind of conditions must be subjected to any particular individual. So because there will be many who will look at cases coming up now, up for parole review, and want to change the laws pending on who the individual is and at which point. So it's going to be vital that we look at the law and we uphold its integrity. Because if we start to change laws subject to any particular individual, I do think will undermine our constitutionality of the country. And then lastly, I would urge that justice not only must be done, it must always be seen to be done. And in this particular case, at the risk of I'm not reducing the stature of Chris Hani. He certainly is a hero to South Africa. I also want to believe there are many victims out there who are still awaiting justice. And part of the anguish in this case was that the family's review or their submission was not properly considered. I would urge that there are many South Africans who are undergoing similar pain of people who have been taken away. We need to allow that restorative process to take place across the sectors of society.
All right, let's leave it there for tonight. Let me thank you both for your time. Build One South Africa leader Mmusi Maimane and public governance expert Zwelinzima Ndevu.